Generations End. Written by C.S. West. Narrated by Matt Godfrey. Chapter 1. I was living in a quiet little town where most everyone knew each other when it happened. Striving to keep my life simple, I had rented a small apartment. Nothing fancy, just what I needed to get by. Bouncing around in the trades for work, I learned what I could, but never really mastered one or another. I was only as loyal to a company as it was to me, so I wasn't forced to stick around long. I made just enough to pay my bills and to travel, which had become my real passion in life. For me, work was a means to really focus on what I loved, not something to dedicate myself to or drown in. Seeing the benefits of living a frugal life didn't come as an epiphany one day. It came from years of observing my mother. I couldn't remember a day my mother wasn't truly happy. Keeping a simple eye was a lesson early learned, and it helped me travel the world at an age when my peers were barely starting to mound the eternal debt they'd be paying off in school loans. I avoided taking lavish trips. I simply backpacked or camped. What was the point of traveling somewhere without experiencing local life and taking in the natural landscape of the area? Often, the most expensive part of the trip was the plane ticket. My apartment was a direct reflection of the life I lived. The furniture was either given to me or was inexpensive. The place was nothing to brag about. It screamed bachelor pad. But every dollar I spent on the apartment meant more time I had to work and more time away from what I really enjoyed. Because my apartment didn't come with a basement or garage, my spare bedroom was a storage unit for all my various activities. Mostly camping and other outdoor gear littered the room, as well as some clothes and well-worn luggage. I even managed to wrestle my kayak up the stairs and jam it in with the rest of my junk in the corner. The biggest flaw in the apartment was that, due to its poor quality and paper-thin walls, it was easy for me to hear, whether I wanted to or not, every move made by my neighbors. I never went out of my way to get to know my neighbors in person, but I knew enough, having heard almost every fight they ever had. They were a middle-aged couple with one kid, and every day when the dad came home, the house erupted. I often wondered if they knew, or even if they cared, that everyone in the building could hear them. Whenever I passed them in the poorly lit hallway, they walked by with hardly a nod or a word, their heads held low, never looking me in the eye. It reminded me of how an abused dog looks, cowering in the corner. People like that were becoming more common. I gathered from the fights I overheard that they had once lived in a house on a nearby lake. The husband lost his job some time back and was forced to move into what his wife referred to as the poorhouse. She had been accustomed to a high standard of living, and now that she had to live within these new means, she was humiliated. She constantly hounded her husband to find a better job so they could get back to their old lifestyle. There was nothing wrong with the apartment. The building was old and outdated, but it was in a safe area, big enough for 2 people, and most of all, it was clean. Yet this was not enough for some people, as it seemed. So the building filled up with people passing by on their way to a better place. For them, this was just a bump on the road of life. I just called it home. I had long since become used to living alone. My father died from a rare liver disease long before I could remember him, leaving just my mother and me. For the most part, we did okay. Somehow we made it work. Keeping things simple was key. It was much easier to not spend extra cash on useless items than it was to work extra hours paying for a credit card bill. But still, we did have some help. My uncle Saul, on my father's side, checked in periodically. He was the only other family I had. Like me, my mom was an only child, and her parents died long ago. That left her and my dad's brother Saul as my only living relatives. I myself never spoke with him, but my mom got calls from him, and I would overhear her updates on my progress in school, as well as other bits of info. He seemed genuinely concerned for our well-being as far as I could tell. He sent checks to my mother to be sure we didn't go without, But even still, she continued to work during the day while I was at school and was always sure to be at home in time to see me get off the bus. Saul always kept himself at a distance. He didn't come to visit us. The phone calls were the closest thing we had to direct contact. But every once in a while, a package showed up on our doorstep. He had a habit of sending random gifts to us, usually things like school supplies or clothes. But every once in a while, it would be something memorable. I still remember the day I opened that random package that contained what seemed to be an unlimited supply of vintage Atari and Nintendo games. The only note I ever got from him rested atop the mix of games within the box. It read, "If they were good enough for your dad and me, they must be good enough for you. Enjoy. Love, Uncle Saul." In between my homework and chores, I squeezed in as much time as I could playing those games. They ate up my free time so much that I failed to notice that my mom had been sleeping more, taking long naps in the afternoon, and staying in bed ever later in the morning. Once I finally noticed, I also started to pick up on other problems. She rarely ate anything, rapidly lost weight, and started to look gaunt. Becoming weak, she missed work and complained constantly of headaches and joint problems. Due to my insistence, she finally went to the doctor, but by then it was too late. The leukemia she was battling was so far advanced that the best the doctors could do was make her comfortable for her remaining days. And just like that, my life was altered. I did what little I could, spending every waking minute at the hospital and trying to appear strong. Inside, though, my mind raced with worry at what my life had in store for me. But then, just before she died, I walked into her hospital room to find a man sitting next to her bed holding her hand. My first thoughts were that he was a doctor, but looking over his clothes, the rolled-up sleeves on his crisp white shirt and suit jacket casually tossed on the couch behind him, I thought he might be someone from the insurance company. The care in which he listened to my mother's barely audible words, leaning in close to hear her struggle absorbing all of it, ruled out that thought too. Patiently he listened, careful not to interrupt, savoring every bit of it. On some level, I knew they were talking about my future, so I waited at the door, frozen, as my fate was decided. When it was clear it was his turn to speak, he did so slowly, matching her pace, careful not to overload her. His deep voice was quiet, barely loud enough for my mom to hear, but too quiet for my eavesdropping ears to pick up on what they were saying. The calming effects it had were visible on my mom's face as she sunk back into her pillow, relieved at whatever the man said. And that's how I finally met my only other living relative. She entrusted Saul and his wife with my care for the short time before I turned 18. Despite the fact that I knew who he was, and that we were family, I knew very little else about him. I had always imagined him as some old guy who sent money and gifts to his brother's family out of obligation only. The gold watch on his left hand, with the matching ring, was a dead giveaway that he had more than just a little money. Even still, his build was that of a man who was used to working hard for a living. His wide shoulders and thick arms stretched the material of his shirt as he gestured while talking to my mom. His features strongly resembled my own. The same dark hair and eyes, but taller and broader shoulders. The first time I shook his hand, he held on to it for an uncomfortably long time, all the while tightening his grip. I sucked in my belly and was struck with the sudden urge to stand up straight as he looked me up and down as if inspecting me. Under his scrutinizing gaze, I was suddenly aware of my unkempt hair and poor posture, and wondered if I could use a breath mint. Over the next few days, he sat very patiently next to her bed, talking to her during her cognitive moments, and reading to her the rest of the time. Even as she faded, his demeanor never broke, keeping a calm, collected exterior, and assuring her that all her affairs would be handled. I myself was numb from the disbelief at how quickly my life had changed. After the funeral, Saul brought me back to my apartment so I could pack what little I had or even still wanted. He never came in with me, Instead, he waited at the door as I scanned our home. In the end, I filled only a small backpack with a change of clothes and the few family pictures we owned. We hardly spoke on the long drive to what I thought was his house in the middle of nowhere. When we finally arrived, I realized his house was still in the process of being built. It was there I spent my remaining year before I was a legal adult. In his own way, Saul helped me move past my loss by keeping me too busy and tired to dwell on anything. I wasn't accustomed to hard physical work. Having spent most of my free time in the past playing video games and doing homework, I was more fluff than tough. But regardless of my physical state, Saul stuck me on a mason crew that was less than sympathetic to the fact that I wasn't exactly conditioned for the job. Despite my objections, Saul on numerous occasions made it clear that I was to spend the remaining months I had under his care working and studying. He bluntly explained that I was ill-equipped to handle the real world, according to his standards, and outlined my inadequacies that would need to be addressed if I was to survive on my own. After pointing out that he only had a year to work with me, he insisted that what was to come was for my own good. Suddenly, I felt like I had been thrown to the wolves. Every day, with the exception of Sunday, I got up before the sun, worked until dark, then read or studied until I went to sleep. The only break I got was at dinner, when Saul's wife, Danielle, insisted that everyone involved in the construction project sit down for dinner. She often felt she needed to rein in Saul, or he would work himself, and everyone else around him, to death. During that time, most of the house was still incomplete, so the dinner table usually meant a very large picnic outside with the structure we worked on towering over us. Since the house was so isolated, all the tradesmen became very close, and I often wondered during our meals together if that was what it felt like to be part of a big family. I completed high school during the night hours in the camper that was dubbed my bedroom. As my waistline shrunk, the hard labor got easier. My appetite doubled after moving in with Saul, and my shirts got looser in some areas and tighter in others. Danielle eventually stepped in, insisting no nephew of hers would be seen dressed like that. She took me to town to go shopping for clothes. After a while, I realized she was the one who sent most of my care packages with clothes over the years. I also had a suspicion that she had used me as an excuse to go shopping herself, as her shopping bags were almost as heavy as my own. Soon, I hardly recognized the stranger who looked back at me in the mirror every morning. Working outside had darkened my skin and lightened my hair, and with the recent weight loss, I once again had a jawline. I had every right to sink into depression given my circumstances, but Saul pushed me, dragged me out of bed at times, worked me so hard I had no energy for anything else. As soon as I became accustomed to any type of work, Saul shifted things around. When I was comfortable hauling stone and felt I knew everyone around me, he assigned me to work on the roof with an entirely new set of people. It took a while to get used to heights, but soon I was comfortable walking along the edge helping the guys install the glass roof. The pain of my recent loss was still there, but he taught me to manage it, remember those we lost, and learn from their example. Both my parents died young, so I always thought I would also. But then I decided I wouldn't waste my life. The last thing my mom would have wanted was for me to shut down. Even once my high school courses were complete, Saul put together a curriculum of books for me to study. I quickly grew to admire Saul. He was harsh at times, but also very driven. His reasoning was that high school was the minimum learning required by the state's standards, but it was far from his standards. He didn't have a lot of faith in college either, but he insisted that learning from books was a good habit. A year later, I turned 18. Despite their protests, I started making arrangements to leave. Part of me wanted to stay until the completion of the estate, but I desperately wanted to start the next chapter of my life. Saul and Danielle once again helped me by finding a job and giving me a little money to help out while I found my way. I had so many clothes and gifts built up from Danielle's shopping sprees that I was forced to leave some there. Over the next 4 years, I bounced around various companies, never sticking around long enough to work my way up the ladder at any of them. I often returned to work for a mason as a temporary laborer during the busiest months in the summer. It was seasonal work, but it was all I needed to save enough to make it through the winter, but also travel during the slower months. Fall had finally arrived, and I was itching for the job to be over. I usually took the winters off because of lack of work, and because it was a good time to get deals on airfare. John was the boss, and always had some sort of smart comment, so we knew where we ranked on his crew. I was the low guy, mixing mud and moving stone over to the scaffold where the aged masons worked. I was there to do everything they were unable to do because of arthritis, or just because they simply didn't want to do it. I didn't mind. I was never afraid to roll up my sleeves and dig in. The job was just what I needed. Long, hard days meant big paychecks. I went about my day as usual, mixing endless batches of mortar for the crew and moving around literally tons of stone for the massive walls that would surround the courtyard that we were tasked to build. We were finishing touch-ups on the final day of a very long project. Days like this one always had a bittersweetness that was unique. It was when we could finally see the result of the efforts of so many skilled people and know that we had a part in making what was, in the end, a work of art. John was a good friend of Saul's when he was still in the business. Back then, Saul was a well-known developer who always used the same contractors, which was how I got a lot of my summer jobs. But times were changing. Even simple jobs like mine were hard to find, and I needed more than just the last name on my job application. As the sun got lower on the horizon and the day's work came to an end, I was cleaning out the wheelbarrow when John came over to me. "You done cleaning out the mixer?" he asked, leaning against his truck to pull a stone out of his boot. "Yes," I replied. "Well, good. Then you can get out of here." He started tying his boot's laces. "So, any big plans for the winter? I'm sorry, but I don't think I have much else going on that we're going to need you for this season. Of course, you don't stick around in the winter anyway, right? Any destinations in mind?" "I don't know. I haven't seen any deals good enough to make me buy a ticket." "Where is it you go every year? Do you rot on a beach somewhere or what? Why not just stick around and save your money? Once you've seen one beach, you've seen them all." "The world's a big place. Before I die, I want to see as much of it as I can," I explained. "You sure you don't want to just settle down and start having a few kids?" he taunted. "Oh, yes, I'm sure a couple of screaming brats at home would make my life so much more enjoyable. How many do you have now, anyway?" "8, he answered as he stood up. "8? I echoed. "Are you nuts? No wonder you work so much." "What can I say? I like kids," he laughed. "I come to work, then go home and go to work. It's a good investment, if you think about it. When I'm old and can't move anymore from doing this job, odds are I will be able to talk one of them into pushing my wheelchair over to the window so I can look at the trees while I eat my Jell-O. I already have them cutting the grass and cleaning the house. The trick is, you gotta get them used to taking care of you early. That way it's not a shocker when they have to do it when you're old." He paused and looked over at his guys as they loaded the last of the scaffolding onto the truck. They moved slowly, beat from the day's work. When they turned back to their trucks to leave, he said, "Some of them are getting older now, old enough to start being replaced. Think of how much money I'll save just with that." "Sounds like you've got things rigged," I replied. "All kidding aside, I need to talk to you about something. There just isn't as much work as there used to be. I'm getting undercut everywhere I turn. I know you were planning on taking the winter off anyway, so I was wondering if I could let you go early. We're going to be slowing down now that this job is done, but I'll keep you in mind if something comes up. You know how it is this time of year." He was right. Guys like him were plagued with uncertainty and anxiety, wondering where their next paycheck would come from, or if it would come at all. Winter was a curse, where he would be sitting home making calls just trying to find something to do. "That should be fine. I think I've had as much as I can stand of you guys anyway," I joked, trying to ease the seriousness of the conversation. Slow winters were inevitable, and part of the reason I took the job in the first place. I should really charge you more for what you guys put me through. Yeah, well, I hope you get a flat tire on your way home, he countered with a smile. John and his crew were more than just masons. They were artists, and stone was their choice of material. For them, it wasn't just a way to get a paycheck at the end of the week. It was a way to make a mark on the world. And it was because of that fact they were always able to stay busy during the summer, despite the economy or John's pessimism. Stone structures had a timelessness to them and would be there long after the crew was gone. Anyone who knew them could look at a project and tell if they had worked on it. There was just a flow to them that was unmatched by any of their competitors. This was a trait that my uncle always looked for in the people he worked with, and was part of the reason he was so popular with his clients. He never advertised, and he was in demand right up until he cut all ties with his contacts and became a shut-in. His reputation held as someone who was second to none in his craft. I finished cleaning the mixer, hosing it down and getting all the slime off the paddles. After leaving it to drain, I joined the rest of the guys in loading up the truck with dismantled scaffolding. With everyone taking 2 planks at a time, we were done in record time. The closer we got to being done for the day, the more it seemed to drag on. John walked around grabbing every little piece of scrap lying around, making sure the job site looked as if we were never there. Just as I was gathering up my tools and throwing them in my bag, a black Audi with tinted windows pulled into the driveway. The car's low profile dragged over the rough terrain, almost ripping the exhaust out from under it. It drove past all the other cars and parked right in front, creating a very expensive obstacle. Rocks seemed to shake from the thump, thump, thump of the pounding music coming from the trunk. The driver's door opened, and a man got out and immediately gasped in excitement at the sight of the house. "Oh my gosh! Would you just look at it?" he said excitedly with a slight lisp. "Would you just look at the stones? It looks so old." He held a gloved hand up to his chest to contain his excitement. I noticed he had a very unnatural walk as he made his way over to inspect the wall, keeping a hand on his assistant's arm so that he wouldn't fall, as if he were an old man walking on ice, not the young man he was. If it was his shoes that made him walk like that, it was probably a good sign he shouldn't be wearing them. His hair was clearly dyed blonde and styled as if a bomb went off in his face. "Who's that?" I quietly asked John. "The designer," he said as we both watched him caress the wall with his hands. "His name is Marvin, but for some reason everyone calls him The Show. Be nice, he's actually very good, and he loves our work. He's also the reason we got this job." "The Show?" I asked, puzzled. "Why?" "Couldn't tell you." "He's very—" I found it hard to describe him. "Eccentric," John said, giving me a warning glance. "I don't know if I love it or hate it," Marvin said. "It is both beautiful and ugly at the same time." "Fabulous. Just fabulous," said the assistant as he struggled with countless samples of fabrics and color swatches. "I personally think this color would look nice." "Well, it is a good thing it is not up to you," said Marvin, brushing aside the yellow sample he was handed. "Honestly, lemon chiffon was so last year. Give me the color fan." The assistant hung his head low as he tucked the sample back in his messenger and pulled out the fan. "I'm eternally sorry. I'll try to suppress any other suggestions." "Well, it is about time you learned to do that. Your little inputs are nothing more than a distraction to my creative genius and are so heinous that they border offensive." Marvin held the fan up to the stone and flipped back and forth trying to decide which color he liked best. "What do you think of this color?" He squinted to read the label under it. "Wisp of Mauve. Oh, and I even like the name." "It looks pleasing by my eye," the assistant said as he looked over Marvin's shoulder. "Well, then it must be garbage." Marvin tore the page out of the fan and tossed it on the ground. He then kicked dirt over it with his shiny teal shoes so he wouldn't have to look at it ever again. "What did I tell you about keeping your opinions to yourself?" 1,000 apologies, sir. It won't happen again." The assistant took a few steps back. "I need a color that is more of the less white." "Does he mean darker?" I asked. "I think so," John whispered back. "Why didn't he just say darker?" "Couldn't tell you. That's just the way he is, I guess." "You there. Come here. Judging from the way your work looks, you must have an eye better than this dolt," he said as he nodded toward the assistant. John and I walked over to where they were standing, which was next to the area that was just completed. "How long before I can paint?" Marvin asked. "Paint what?" John asked, puzzled. "The wall. What do you think I'm talking about?" He slapped the stone wall. "Tell me you're not a simpleton as well. That would be unfortunate." "You can't be serious," John pleaded. "The stone's naturally beautiful. To paint it would be a tragedy." Yes, but everyone's doing that. I just wanted the texture of stone, so I'll ask you again, how long before I can paint?" "Painting it would be an epic mistake. What can I say to change your mind?" John begged. "Look down the street." Marvin pointed at the various houses. "Stone house with stucco, stone house with siding, stone house with more stucco. I didn't want this work of art, my project, to be lost among these atrocities. I want this house to say something." Marvin abruptly turned with the color fan and slapped it against the wall. "Just look at these gorgeous colors. Bunny notes pink, raspberry blush, Provence creme, lavender lipstick, hot lips, pink pansy, sweet naivete, teacup rose, dream whip. I mean, the possibilities are endless. By surrendering to my limitations, it in a sense clips my wings. I am an eagle. I need to soar. Do you want your work to stand out or blend in?" "I want it to stand out, but in a good way," barked John. "Not ruined by your creative moment." "Pay no attention to these heathens. Don't let them influence your master plan. They have done enough damage as it is. Begone, peasant," the assistant shouted. "Your opinions have been noted and will be ignored, as they should be." "Well, that's my cue to leave." I grabbed my stuff and walked to my car. "Peace out." Even as I drove off, I heard John and the designers getting louder with every passing moment. Aside from being Friday, this day was no different than any other day. When I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment building, it was already dark. I got out of my truck and made the long climb up to the 3rd floor, where my unit was. On the way up, I passed my neighbor. As she hurried past, I could see her red eyes, which indicated that I had just missed their latest fight, most likely over dinner. With neighbors like them, I knew why I lived alone. I never had to clean up after anyone else, and I certainly didn't have to put up with complaints about my living habits. I could come and go whenever I wanted, and didn't have to answer to anyone. Until Bruno. I had been suckered into watching a friend's dog. A giant lug-headed brindle boxer. A 70-pound lump of meat, fur, and teeth. Despite being a handsome creature with broad shoulders, a wide chest, ribs covered in muscle, and a large head with droopy jowls, he had the worst excuse for a tail I had ever seen. It was docked off, leaving him with a short nub to wag, a fact that I teased him about constantly. It seemed like he was a little self-conscious of it, and that's why he wagged his entire rear end to make up for it. Boxers were supposed to be high-energy dogs, but this one was a glorified rug, just another thing for me to trip on. On the upside, he was good for hanging out with, and as much as I hated to admit it, he kept me company. He was also a good way to dispose of pizza crust and other unwanted scraps from my kitchen. His owners had taken a 3-week backpacking trip to Alaska. I was slated to go, but couldn't because of work. Seemed foolish now that I was out of a job. Bruno was trying to pull his weight by letting me know when people got close to my front door and keeping my feet warm while I tried to watch TV. That's one thing I liked about him. No matter what time of the day, he was always game for whatever I had planned, as long as he could be part of it. If I wanted to go for a run at 3 in the morning, he was game for it. If I wanted to watch a movie in the middle of the morning when I should be working, he was willing. If I wanted to watch the news after work and eat junk food, he was fine with it, as long as I gave him some. When I walked through my door, I set down my lunch bucket and kicked off my boots, eager to be rid of them, and got out of my work clothes. Bruno sat in the middle of the kitchen looking guilty from the latest disaster around him. Apparently, while I was gone doing something useful with my day, he thought it would be a good idea to go to work on my pillow, shredding it and spilling the contents all over my place. I also noticed a large amount of hair on my bed from his afternoon nap. For a dog as lazy as him, he was very good at opening doors and getting into rooms I went to great lengths to keep him out of. His owners assured me he didn't need a kennel and was a very good house guest, but all of their other friends just didn't have room for him, as if I did. I stewed over that conversation with them, talking me into taking their beast into my home. They never mentioned his farting, snoring, and lack of respect for personal space. In the time I had spent over at their house, I had gotten to know Bruno. But at their house, he was always on his best behavior. Even though it was nice to have him around, I wouldn't shed any tears when they came and got him tomorrow. After I got done cleaning up all the fuzz off the floor, my bed, and his face, I continued with my after-work ritual of walking Bruno down 3 flights of stairs to do his business outside, and then back up. I showered, changed, and made myself some dinner. Tonight was my specialty, mac and cheese, and it was done just in time for my favorite show, the news. I sat down on my couch with the bowl of golden noodles smothered in cheese cooling on the table in front of me. Bruno's eyes never left the bowl. He watched it intently, waiting for me to take my attention off it so he could move in and snatch it. I clicked on the TV and shuffled through the channels to find the right station. The big story dominating the news for what seemed like months was about a quarantined town in the Guangdong province in China. When reports of a strange illness affecting the residents started to circulate, coverage of the massive effort to seal the area was featured on the news every night. The illness was such that the world watched on as the isolated area was depopulated. It struck me as odd that the surrounding community became a frenzied ghetto of thugs and looters. The mass exodus of people in fear created the perfect atmosphere for thieves and squatters. It wasn't until relief shipments were stolen that troops were shipped in from all over the world in an effort to restore the calm. Inside the sealed area, the occupants did what they could to survive. A team was deployed to investigate and track the spread of the disease. They worked diligently to try to determine the cause, as well as develop a treatment. While the investigators learned what they could about the virus, another team cared for the people who were already sick. They were separated from those who were dying and placed in temporary structures that were set up in place of the small, ineffective hospital. At first, they tracked the sick, being sure to get names, birth dates, and information about living relatives. But before long, the volume of infected people overwhelmed the few who were not sick, and research was abandoned for more pressing tasks. Men in white suits kept a continuous fire in the center of town. Hazardous materials of all kinds were burned there in an attempt to destroy all traces of the disease. Desperate to escape, some opted to take their chances with the troops who surrounded the town, rather than face what seemed to be a fatal choice if they stayed. The world watched as entire families were wiped out. Reports of responders contracting the disease flooded the news feeds until finally, like a fire running out of fuel, the virus nearly ran out of people to infect. Tonight's news focused on the fact that they had declared the town to be sanitized when the order finally came to burn it to the ground. Only a handful of people survived. They were isolated for observation. They were more animal than human at that point. Some were lucky and managed to hunker down in their apartments and outlast those around them. Others had resorted to eating garbage and living in extremely unsanitary conditions. Covered head to toe in dirt and grime, They were escorted through a series of tents to receive much-needed medical attention. After being examined and cleaned up, some were interviewed, but most kept silent about what had happened in the months they were under quarantine. Despite the healthy appetite I had worked up during the day, the sight of what investigators found in the city, detailed shots of mass graves, stills of the virus itself, was enough to make my dinner seem less appealing. I tested the bowl's contents, scooping up a mound and shoveling it into my mouth. The now cold noodles tasted like ash, as I thought about what the people in that city must have done to survive as long as they did. I walked over to the kitchen and set the bowl down on the linoleum floor for Bruno to enjoy. He attacked the bowl and inhaled the noodles, sure to get each and every one of them. As he ate, the bowl slid around on the floor, clanging against the wall or cabinets, with Bruno blindly following it. As he ate, I sat back down on the couch to catch the rest of the story. With the crisis apparently over, the government tried to find the cause of the flu. They showed interviews with various experts who gave reasons like overpopulation, water that was tainted with bird droppings, and people with weak immune systems living too close to diseased animals. One man said that diseases that managed to pass from animal to human were not always deadly, but as they mutated and matured, they grew ever more effective. It was fascinating, but tragic all the same. It was hard to imagine that a little germ could threaten the lives of so many. But even more disturbing was how the people had treated one another. Once sealed off from the world, people hoarded clean water as others went without. No one knew how long it would last, so they stocked up on what they could, even if it meant taking from others. The effects of the flu didn't stop at the edge of the city limits. Every rise in the death toll had a ripple effect through the rest of the world. In other countries, people feared the worst if containment measures failed. Some people went into a panic and bought up canned food and bottled water. Nothing sold more papers and made people watch the news more than bad news. They were very clear in pointing out what would happen if something like this got out and the rest of the world was exposed to it. They provided models that predicted the spread of the virus, as well as theories on how the general population would react to such a catastrophe. I flipped through the channels briefly, and, as usual of late, it didn't matter the station. They all reported on the same event. Long after the news ended, I realized I was still staring at the TV when Bruno's head plopped on my lap with his leash in his mouth. It was getting late, and he hadn't had his walk yet. I knew that if he didn't get it, I would pay for it later. He'd either annoy me by whimpering outside my bedroom door, or he would make a snack of my pillows while I was out. Somehow he knew to avoid my furniture, including my designer Kmart futon. Even he had better standards than to eat a crappy couch. He didn't even try to sneak on it for a forbidden nap while I was away. Instead, he figured out how to work the doorknob to my bedroom and help himself to my bed, which was actually the nicest piece of furniture I owned. The doorknob was hardly recognizable from all the dents where his teeth bit in the cheap brass as he forced his way in so many times. As I got on my shoes for our nightly walk, I realized I didn't remember his owners telling me anything about taking him for walks. As a matter of fact, I couldn't imagine either of them taking him out regularly. They just were the type of people who never had any time. Sometimes I wondered why they owned a dog at all. Well, soon it wouldn't be my problem. He would be out of my hair forever. But still, for a dog, he seemed rather insistent about getting out, and I wondered if I was being played. I remembered when I was a kid and told the babysitter, "Oh yeah, my parents always let me have ice cream before bed." Maybe he wasn't as dumb as he looked. Bruno got impatient and could hardly contain himself, running in circles and wagging his poor excuse of a tail to the point where he fell over. He already knew he was going for a walk and was ready for his night out on the town. I realized that I was part of the problem for the monster I saw before me, but giving in to a monster like him was still a better option than having him eat my place while I tried to sleep. As we walked out my apartment, I could hear the neighbors starting up yet another fight, and I wondered if Bruno hated listening to them as much as I did. Maybe he had some insight as to what was going on next door, and that's why he liked his walks. Bruno's heavy breathing and the sound of his jingling collar cut through the silence in the dark stairwell as we made our way down and finally outside. The night air had a refreshingly crisp, cool bite, typical for fall nights. The lights of the town were enough to light up the red brick sidewalk, but not enough to wash out the stars. We walked down the street past Louie's, my favorite little diner, and past a hardware store, grocery store, ice cream shop, and a few other boutiques, all family-owned and operated. We cut through the park and over a small pedestrian-only bridge that crossed a small creek into the woods. The narrow path weaved through the trees and was often crowded this time of night. Most everyone was friendly. Seeing the same faces on our walks, I realized I wasn't the only one with a nightly routine. As we made our way through town, people got out of our way and gave us more room than we needed to pass. Bruno was not a rare breed, but I noticed people mistaking him for a very large pit bull. I couldn't imagine how anyone could see him as a vicious man-eater, perhaps because I had lived with him for a little while and knew just how harmless he was. He was fearless, but in a very low-key sort of way. I once saw him try to pick a fight with a freight train. I wondered what would have happened to him if I'd let go of his leash. I had time to go over what I heard on the news about the city in China being deemed clean and what would happen if it was exposed to the rest of us. What would it do to big cities, which acted like petri dishes for disease? How long would it take for people to try to get out before getting infected? Or would they try to wait it out in their homes? Depending on the surrounding temperature and humidity, the flu could live up to 48 hours on a doorknob, a fact they regularly repeated on the news. What chance would people have to make it out of the infected area without catching the virus? As I made my way back to my place, I saw something that stood out to me. A procession of Hummers, followed by big trucks full of orange barrels pulled through town. It was a little late in the year for road work, and the fact that they were using Hummers was very peculiar. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I shook the thought out of my head and went back to my apartment. It had been a long day, and the promise of a warm bed never sounded better. I fed Bruno, brushed my teeth, and finally got my chance to catch some desperately needed sleep. As soon as my head hit the pillow, I heard the sound of my bedroom door being nosed open and the pat of Bruno's paws as he bedded down on the floor. Why he would rather sleep on the hard wood next to me than on the bed I made up for him in the kitchen was a mystery to me, but I was too tired to convince him otherwise.